Birdie Calloway did not look up from the stove when the front parlor bell rang twice, sharp and impatient, the way Cordelia Vance always rang it when she wanted to be obeyed faster than was reasonable. She kept stirring, slow, even circles through the gravy, the way her mother had taught her before her mother's hands had gotten too unsteady to hold a spoon at all, and let the sound roll past her the way she let most things at the Prescott house roll past her, without giving them the satisfaction of her hurry. A bell rung twice usually meant company. Company usually meant more work and no more thanks than usual. She had learned a long time ago that the surest way to survive a kitchen was to never let anyone see you rushing for them. Footsteps came down the back hallway anyway, not the light, put-upon tread of Mrs. Prescott's maid, but something heavier, more deliberate, spurred boots on hardwood, the particular unhurried cadence of a man who had never once in his life needed to walk fast to get people's attention. Birdie turned, wooden spoon still in hand, and found Sheriff Nathaniel Boone standing in her kitchen doorway with his hat already off, looking at her the way a man looks at the one thing in a house worth looking at. "Sheriff," she said carefully, wiping her hands on her apron, "you're a long way from the jailhouse." "I know it," he said. "Let them wonder why. If you have ever stood in someone else's kitchen, cooking someone else's supper, wondering if anyone would ever look past the apron to the woman wearing it, stay with me. This story was written for you. Subscribe to this channel. Tell me your city in the comments. I want to see exactly how far Birdie's story travels tonight, and stay until the very end, because you are not going to want to miss what the sheriff says when Cordelia Vance finally corners him in front of the whole town. Now, let's go back to where it all began. The spring of 1881 came late to Prairie Bend, Kansas Territory, wet and green and a little merciless, the way spring always came to a town that lived and died by its wheat. The creek ran high along the mill road, the mud sucked at every wagon wheel from the depot to the church steps, and the talk at the general store had turned, as it always did this time of year, to whose seed corn had rotted in the ground and whose hadn't. Birdie Calloway had been awake since 4 that morning, same as every morning, working by lamplight in the kitchen of the Prescott house on the good side of Prairie Bend, the side with the wraparound porches and the glass in every window instead of oiled paper. She was 28 years old, broad through the shoulders and solidly built in the particular way of a woman who had spent 15 years standing over a stove, and her hands, quick, sure, scarred faintly along the left thumb from a lifetime of hot cast iron, could turn a joint of tough range beef into something that made grown ranchers close their eyes at the table. She had a round, open face, brown hair she kept pinned back plain and practical under a kitchen cap, and the kind of quiet competence that an entire household depended on constantly and complimented almost never. She cooked for Josiah and Cordelia Prescott, who owned the biggest dry goods concern in 3 counties, and she had cooked for them for 6 years, ever since her father's accident at the lumber mill had left him with a crushed hip and a chest that rattled worse every winter, and the family had needed a wage that didn't depend on the weather. Her father, Ezra Calloway, sat most days now in a chair by the window of their small rented house 2 streets back from the Prescotts, needing liniment and laudanum that came dear from the pharmacist on 4th Street, and needing, more than anything, a daughter who did not stop working long enough to fall apart over what she could not fix. So Birdie did not stop. She cooked breakfast, dinner, and supper for the Prescott family, and whatever guests they entertained, she put by preserves in the fall and rendered lard in the winter, and she did not, in 6 years, allow herself very much time to wonder what any of it was building toward. Mrs. Prescott was, by most accounts, a fair enough employer, though fair in the way of a woman who had never once had to wonder where her next meal was coming from, and therefore assumed everyone else's worries were smaller than they felt. She paid Birdie on time, praised her cooking generously to guests, and rarely at all to Birdie's own face, and considered herself, on the strength of 6 years' employment, something close to a benefactress. It did not occur to her, most days, to ask how Ezra Calloway's chest was holding up, or whether the pharmacist's bill had come due again, or whether the woman who fed her family 3 meals a day had eaten a full one herself. Birdie did not resent her for it, exactly. She had simply stopped expecting otherwise, the same way she had stopped expecting most things from most people in Prairie Bend. The lumber mill accident that had taken the strength from her father's hip had happened on an ordinary Tuesday in 1875, a beam come loose and swinging where no beam should have swung, and Ezra Calloway had gone from a man who could split a cord of wood before breakfast to a man who needed help crossing a room, all in the space of one afternoon. The mill owner had paid out a single lump sum, called it generous, and considered the matter closed. 6 years of laudanum and liniment and a doctor's visits, whenever the rattle in his chest turned to something worse, had eaten through that sum inside of 2 years, and Birdie had been the one standing between her father and the county poor farm ever since. One wage, one kitchen, one steady pair of hands, holding up considerably more than a household budget. She did not speak of any of this to the Prescotts, or to anyone else in Prairie Bend, because there was no version of speaking of it that did not sound like asking for pity, and Birdie Calloway had decided a long time ago that she would rather go hungry than be pitied. She went to the Methodist church every Sunday and stood in the back, near the door, same as she had every Sunday since she'd started working for wages, instead of sitting with a family of her own in a family pew. It was the second Sunday of April when Cordelia Vance, no relation to the Prescotts, though she made a great deal of being mistaken for one on account of the name, came through the church doors ahead of Birdie with her daughter Adeline on her arm, both of them dressed in traveling wool that had certainly cost more than Birdie's wages for the month, and passed within 2 feet of her without so much as a glance. Adeline Vance, 20 and pretty and thoroughly aware of it, was laughing at something the banker's wife had said. Neither of them looked at Birdie. Neither of them ever did. "Bless her heart," Cordelia murmured to the woman beside her, not troubling to lower her voice past the point where it might not carry. "Cooking other people's suppers at her age. Some women simply aren't built for a household of their own, I suppose. It isn't anyone's fault." The woman beside her made a small, sympathetic sound that meant nothing and cost nothing. Birdie kept her hands folded and her eyes on the pulpit and did not let her face change. She had heard some version of that sentence in some version of that doorway more times than she cared to count, and she had long ago decided the only real defense against it was to keep breathing, keep her back straight, and keep being exactly who she already was. She was not unhappy, precisely. She had steady work. She had her father, difficult and beloved, safe and fed. She had a trade that used her hands well and kept a roof over both their heads most months. What she did not have, and had stopped actively wanting sometime around her 25th birthday, was any expectation that Prairie Bend would ever see her as anything more than the Prescotts' cook, reliable, useful, and entirely beside the point. Sheriff Nathaniel Boone was, by contrast, the single most discussed unmarried man in the county, and had been for the better part of 8 years. He'd taken the badge at 26 after his predecessor was shot chasing cattle thieves out past the county line, and he'd worn it since with the same unhurried steadiness he brought to everything else. He was 34 now, tall and sun-weathered, quiet by nature and direct when he did speak, and entirely uninterested in the elaborate social performance that every marriageable family in the county insisted on staging whenever he showed his face at a social. He collected debts owed to the town's poorest families out of his own pocket, more often than anyone knew, had ridden 2 days through a spring flood the year before to fetch the Hargrove family's doctor, when no one else would risk the river crossing, and never once mentioned either kindness to a living soul. Birdie only knew about the flood because old Mrs. Hargrove told the story at the Mercantile with tears standing in her eyes. Nathaniel Boone did not posture. He did not need to. He simply did the useful thing, quietly, and let people talk if they wanted to, which they did. constantly. Cordelia Vance had made it her personal project, for going on 2 years now, to see her daughter Adeline married to the sheriff, and she pursued this project with the tireless, unembarrassed determination of a woman who had never once failed to get what she wanted. Every church supper, every spring social, every excuse for a gathering in Prairie Bend had, for 2 years, been quietly engineered around throwing Adeline into Nathaniel's path. The sheriff attended these gatherings with the patient, faintly weary good manners of a man doing his civic duty, danced when he was asked, complimented the refreshments, and rode home to the jailhouse afterward, having committed himself to precisely nothing. Birdie had watched all of this unfold from a comfortable distance, the way she watched most of Prairie Bend's business, with mild interest and no personal stake whatsoever. She had spoken to Sheriff Boone perhaps 3 times in her life, brief practical exchanges about nothing at all, and had no particular reason to think of him as anything other than the town's most eligible bachelor, a fact of Prairie Bend's landscape, like the creek or the courthouse clock. That changed on a Tuesday in late April, when Nathaniel Boone walked into the Prescott kitchen through the back door with a burlap sack over one shoulder and a look on his face like a man bracing for an argument he already expected to lose. "Found this in a wagon I impounded off the Hendry brothers," he said, by way of greeting, setting the sack on her work table. "Sugar, coffee, a side of bacon. Contraband, technically, until a judge says otherwise, and a judge won't say otherwise for a week at least. Seemed a waste to let it spoil in an evidence locker." "That's a generous reading of the law, Sheriff," Birdie said, opening the sack and taking honest stock of what was inside before she'd fully registered whose idea this was. "I've been known to read generously when it suits me." He nodded at the stove behind her, where a pot of beans had been simmering since dawn. "That yours?" "It is." "Smells like something a man could live on." "It's beans, Sheriff. Most men can live on those regardless." "Not the way you make them, apparently. Half the county talks about your suppers like they were miracles." He looked, for just a moment, almost embarrassed to have said it. "I've heard the Prescotts brag on you at the courthouse more than they brag on their own dry goods." Birdie set the sack of coffee down and looked at him properly for the first time, not Sheriff Boone the fixture, the fact of the landscape, but a tired man who'd clearly ridden hard that morning and thought first, before anything else, of not letting good food go to waste in a locked room. "You didn't have to bring this here," she said. "You could have kept it for the jailhouse." "I could have. Man alone in a jailhouse with a side of bacon just lets it go rancid, though. Seemed smarter to bring it somewhere. It'd get used properly." He settled his hat back on. "I'll come collect the pot Thursday, if that suits. Mrs. Prescott won't mind me borrowing her cook's good sense for an evidence report." It did not suit, strictly speaking, for the sheriff of Prairie Bend to be dropping by the Prescott kitchen on a semi-regular basis to discuss the disposition of impounded groceries, and Birdie knew it. But she found herself saying, "Thursday, then," before she'd properly decided whether she wanted to. He came back that Thursday, and the Thursday after that. Always with some small, defensible reason: a crate of apples off a wagon gone bad on the road, a question about whether spoiled flour could be legally destroyed or had to be returned to its owner. Once, transparently, no reason at all beyond a cup of coffee and 10 minutes of quiet while he read through a stack of paperwork at her kitchen table. He never asked her to sit with him and never lingered past what a sensible visit required. But he came back, week after week, through May and into June, and Birdie began, despite every practical instinct she owned, to notice the particular quiet he carried into a room, the way he asked after her father's chest without being asked to, the way he never once looked at her the way the rest of Prairie Bend looked at her, as a fact of the furniture, useful and unremarkable. Word of the sheriff's Thursday visits reached the Mercantile before the second month was out, the way word reached the Mercantile about everything eventually, and Birdie found herself the subject of a curiosity she had not felt aimed at her in the whole of her adult life. The butcher's wife asked, with poorly disguised interest, whether the sheriff took his coffee sweet. The Prescott's upstairs maid began finding excuses to be near the kitchen on Thursday mornings that had never once occurred to her on any other day of the week. Mrs. Prescott herself remarked, over a supper of roast chicken that Birdie had prepared with rather more care than usual, that it was good business having the sheriff friendly with the household, on account of the Hendry brothers still owing the Prescott dry goods concern a considerable sum, and never once considered that her cook might be the reason for the friendliness rather than its beneficiary. Birdie let all of it roll past her, same as she let most things roll past her. But she noticed, despite herself, that she had begun looking forward to Thursdays in a way she had not looked forward to a single day of the week in longer than she cared to admit. Not for the impounded groceries, which had grown thinner and less plausible as excuses by the third week, but for the 10 or 15 minutes of a tired man sitting quietly at her table, asking after her father's chest, telling her small, true things about his mother's roses or the particular stubbornness of the Hendry brothers' mule, and looking at her the entire while as though she were the most interesting person he had spoken to all week. He brought her father a jar of liniment from the Cheyenne pharmacist's traveling supply one Thursday in late May, mentioning almost as an afterthought that he'd been passing that way on county business, and thought of it, and refused, with a mildness that did not invite further argument, to accept any payment for it. Ezra Calloway, who did not warm easily to strangers, took to the sheriff within a single visit, the two of them talking mule breeding and territorial politics for the better part of an hour, while Birdie cooked supper and pretended not to listen to every word of it. "You always talk business in a kitchen, Sheriff?" she asked him one Thursday in early June, setting a cup of coffee in front of him without being asked. "Only the kitchen's worth talking business in." He turned the cup once between his hands before drinking. "My mother kept a garden behind the old house on 3rd Street. Roses, mostly, though she never had the patience for roses. They wanted more coddling than she was willing to give anything, including me, most days. She'd have liked you, I think. She didn't suffer people who complained about hard work. She just did it and expected everyone around her to keep up." "You talk about your mother the way most men talk about their horses," Birdie said, fondly, and like she'd have opinions about your posture. That, finally, got a real laugh out of him, short, surprised, entirely unguarded, and something in Birdie's chest shifted slightly out of the careful, well-worn groove it had occupied for 6 years. It was in the 3rd week of June that Ezra Calloway's chest turned worse than it had been in over a year, the rattle deepening overnight into something that kept him upright in his chair rather than lying down, gasping through nights that left Birdie sitting beside him with a lamp burning until dawn, too frightened to sleep and too proud to send for anyone. The pharmacist's laudanum eased him some, but the doctor who examined him on the Wednesday said plainly, in the flat, careful voice doctors used when they didn't want to frighten a grown woman more than the truth already warranted, that a man in Ezra's condition needed rest, better food than a poor man's table usually managed, and medicine enough to keep the worst of the coughing at bay through the coming winter, medicine that would cost more over the coming months than Birdie's wages alone could reasonably stretch to cover. She did not mention any of this to the Prescotts, and she did not mention it to Nathaniel Boone when he came by that Thursday and found her moving through the kitchen with the particular brittle carefulness of a woman holding herself together by main force. He noticed anyway. He always noticed. In the quiet, unhurried way he noticed most things, and he did not press her to explain it. He simply stayed longer than usual, split the last of the morning's coffee between them, and talked mule breeding with Ezra through the thin wall separating the kitchen from the sick room, until the old man's breathing eased enough for him to laugh at something Nathaniel said about the Hendry brothers' stubbornness. It was a small thing. It cost him nothing but an hour of his Thursday. But Birdie found herself, that evening, crying quietly over a basin of dishwater in a way she had not allowed herself to cry in longer than she could remember, not from grief, precisely, but from the strange, unfamiliar relief of not carrying the whole of a hard week entirely alone. Her father noticed the change in her before she let herself admit it to herself. "That's the third Thursday running. You've come home smiling before you've told me why," Ezra Calloway said from his chair by the window, laudanum bottle within reach on the sill, chest rattling softly with every breath. "Don't reckon it's the beans making you smile like that, Birdie girl." "It's nothing, Pa," she said, and did not entirely believe herself when she said it. But June brought the county's spring social to the Grange Hall, same as it did every year, and June brought Cordelia Vance's 2-year campaign to a head, same as it always eventually did, because word had reached Cordelia, the way word reached Cordelia about everything eventually, that Sheriff Boone had been seen at the Prescott house rather more Thursdays than seemed accountable by evidence disposal alone. Birdie had not planned on attending. Cooks did not, generally, attend the socials thrown by the families who employed them, not as guests. But Mrs. Prescott, in an uncharacteristic fit of generosity, or perhaps simple vanity, wanting her cook's celebrated cornbread displayed at the potluck table under her own household's name, had insisted Birdie come along to oversee the serving of it, and had loaned her, for the occasion, a dress of soft blue wool 2 seasons out of fashion, but finer than anything Birdie owned outright. Adeline Vance found her near the refreshment table before her mother did, which surprised Birdie enough that she nearly dropped the serving knife. "That cornbread's yours, isn't it?" Adeline said. "Not quite a question. Mother had me sample it before we left the house, to make sure it was fit to serve under our name at the table. She'll never say so to your face, but she said, and I quote, that it was the finest thing she'd eaten all spring." Adeline's mouth twisted, not unkindly. "She'll also spend half tonight pretending she never said it, on account of you being the one who made it. I thought you ought to know regardless." "It seemed only fair." "That's kind of you to say," Birdie said carefully, unsure what to make of the girl her employer's rival had spent 2 years aiming at the sheriff, like an arrow at a target. "I'm not being kind, particularly. I'm being honest, which Mother finds considerably more inconvenient." Adeline glanced once toward the dance floor, where Nathaniel Boone stood in polite conversation with the banker, looking, even from a distance, like a man waiting for a more interesting conversation to begin. "For what it's worth, Miss Calloway, I've never once wanted to marry the sheriff. I've wanted for 2 years to marry considerably less of my mother's ambition and considerably more of my own choosing. But nobody's troubled to ask me that, so nobody's heard it." She looked back at Birdie, something almost apologetic in her face. "I only tell you because I think you're about to hear something unkind from her tonight, and I'd rather you knew beforehand that not everyone standing beside her agrees with it." She was gone before Birdie could properly answer, back into the crowd, leaving Birdie standing at the refreshment table with a serving knife in one hand and a considerably more complicated picture of the Vance household than she'd carried into the evening. She stood near the refreshment table for most of the rest of the evening, same as she stood near the door at church, watching the dancing from a comfortable, familiar distance, until Cordelia Vance found her there, wearing the particular bright, brittle smile of a woman about to say something unkind and call it concern. "Birdie Calloway," Cordelia said, "I hardly recognized you out of your apron, though I suppose a fine dress can only do so much." "Mrs. Vance," Birdie said evenly. "I only mention it," Cordelia went on, in the carrying half-whisper she reserved for cruelties she wanted witnessed, "because I understand the sheriff has taken to visiting the Prescott kitchen with some frequency of late, and I would hate for you to misread simple neighborliness as anything more than that. A man in Nathaniel Boone's position could have his pick of any woman in this county." Her eyes traveled, deliberately, over the whole of Birdie's sturdy frame, and she let the silence do the rest of the insult before finishing it plainly. "No man wants a wife who cooks better than she looks, dear. It isn't unkind to say so. It's simply how the world is built. Best you understand that plainly, before you go embarrassing yourself, or him." Somewhere behind Birdie, the fiddle music faltered, not stopped, but noticeably faltered, the way a room does when it has heard something it isn't sure it was meant to hear. Birdie felt the old, familiar instinct rise in her, the one that had gotten her through 6 years of doorways and church pews and murmured sympathy that cost nothing. Keep breathing, keep your back straight, give it no satisfaction. She opened her mouth to say something plain and unremarkable, and let the moment pass the way she had let every moment like it pass. She did not get the chance. "Mrs. Vance." Sheriff Nathaniel Boone's voice came from directly behind Cordelia, quiet, level, and entirely without the good-natured patience he usually spent on Prairie Bend's social performances. The fiddle stopped altogether. Cordelia turned, composure only briefly slipping. "Sheriff, I was only—" "I heard what you were only," Nathaniel said. He crossed the remaining distance to stand beside Birdie, close enough that the whole Grange Hall understood exactly what it was witnessing before he said another word. "I've been coming to the Prescott kitchen every Thursday for near 10 weeks now, Mrs. Vance, and I expect half this room has drawn their own conclusions about why, same as you have. I'll save everyone the trouble of guessing." He looked at Birdie, not at Cordelia, when he said the rest of it. It was never about the coffee, or the impounded groceries, or anything else I told myself it was about. I kept finding reasons to sit in a kitchen with a woman who feeds half this county like it's the easiest thing in the world, and never once asks anyone to notice her for it. That's exactly the kind of wife I want, Mrs. Vance. Not despite anything you just said. Because of all of it. The Grange Hall had gone entirely silent, the way a room goes silent when it realizes, all at once, that it is watching something it will still be talking about at church the following Sunday. "I don't have a ring," Nathaniel said, quieter now, once the fiddle had cautiously resumed and the room's attention had drifted, mercifully, elsewhere. "I hadn't planned on doing this tonight. I'd planned on doing it a good deal more carefully than shouting it across a dance floor at Cordelia Vance's expense." "You did shout it across a dance floor," Birdie said. "I did." He looked, for the first time since she'd known him, genuinely uncertain. "I meant every word of it, though. Not because of tonight, and not because your dress is blue, and it's the finest thing I've ever seen you wear. I'm asking because you are the most capable, most honest, least breakable person I have ever known, and I would like to spend the rest of my life finding excuses to sit in a room with you." Something settled into place in Birdie's chest that she had stopped expecting, sometime around her 25th birthday, would ever settle at all. "Ask me properly, then," she said, "since you've already done the hard part in front of the whole county." He almost laughed. "Marry me, Birdie Calloway." "Yes," she said. "Obviously, yes." It was 3 days later, sorting through her father's medicine bottles to see how much longer the current supply of laudanum would stretch, that Birdie discovered the pharmacist's account had already been settled in full for the next 6 months. Quietly, without her knowledge, by a payment the pharmacist would only describe as coming from a concerned party in law enforcement. Ezra Calloway wept when she told him, and did not apologize for it, and said only that he had always known his daughter would end up exactly where she belonged, even if it had taken the whole county rather longer to notice the same thing. They were married 5 weeks later, on a warm Saturday at the end of July, in the same small Methodist church where Birdie had spent 6 years, standing quietly near the back door. She did not stand near the door that day. She wore a dress of soft blue wool, altered by her own steady hands, and when the minister asked Nathaniel if he took this woman, he said yes before the sentence was finished, which made half the congregation laugh, Birdie included. Ezra Calloway sat in the front pew, breathing easier than he had in months on the strength of medicine that no longer had to be rationed, and cried through the entire ceremony without a single trace of apology. 5 years later, Birdie still cooked, though no longer for wages, and no longer only for the Prescott household. She and Nathaniel had built a modest house on the edge of town, with a kitchen twice the size of the one she'd started in, and on Sunday afternoons she fed half the county off her own table, same as she always had, except now it was her own name on the invitation and her own choosing who sat at it. Cordelia Vance's standing in Prairie Bend diminished considerably in the years that followed, after her husband's land dealings out past the county line drew rather more scrutiny than she'd bargained for, and Adeline, freed at last from 2 years of being aimed like an arrow at a target she'd never actually wanted, married a school teacher from the next county over the following spring, and appeared, by all accounts, considerably happier for it. It was on an ordinary Wednesday in the spring of Birdie's 5th year of marriage that a young woman came to her kitchen door looking for work. Quiet, capable-handed, dressed carefully in clothes mended more than once, with the particular way of holding her shoulders that Birdie recognized instantly, the compressed posture of someone who has learned to take up as little space as possible because the world has made it plain that space is not meant for her. "I heard you might need help in the kitchen," the young woman said. "I can cook. I know I'm not." She stopped, started again, eyes going sideways rather than direct. "I know I'm not what most houses want serving out front, where folks can see." Birdie looked at her for a long moment, at the careful hands, the whole familiar architecture of a person who had been told, in one form or another, that she was too much or not enough, for longer than anyone should have to carry that particular weight. "What's your name?" Birdie said. "Grace." "Grace," Birdie said. "My front table is exactly where I intend to put you, because you have good hands, and I judge people by their hands, not by whatever nonsense this county has decided to judge them by instead. Come in. Have you eaten?" Grace hadn't. Birdie sat her down, put food in front of her, and asked about her cooking before she asked about anything else, because the food was more urgent than the interview, and some lessons, once learned properly, never needed relearning. Over the following weeks, Grace proved to have a fine, steady hand with pastry and a memory for a recipe that put Birdie's own younger self to shame, and within a month, Birdie had begun teaching her the finer points of the trade, the same patient way her own mother had once taught her, not as charity and not as a favor to be repaid, but as one capable woman recognizing the work in another and refusing to let the county's opinion of her stand in the way of it. Word got around Prairie Bend, as word always did, that the sheriff's wife had taken on a girl nobody else would hire out front, and for once the talk that followed Birdie through the mercantile and the church aisle carried no pity in it at all, only a grudging, unfamiliar respect that she found she did not mind half so much as she'd once minded its absence. Ezra Calloway lived to see his daughter's second child born, a boy with his mother's steady hands and his father's stubborn chin, and spent his last good years exactly where he'd always hoped to spend them, warm, fed, and thoroughly unbothered by any question of what he owed anyone for the privilege. That evening, after Grace had gone home with a job and a fair wage and an expression Birdie recognized clean through to the bone, Nathaniel found his wife on the back porch, a cup of coffee gone cold in her hands, thinking about something larger than the day's accounts. "You saw yourself in her," he said. "Not a question. A version of it," Birdie said. "The part before the part where someone finally looks up." He came and sat beside her, not touching, just near, the way they often were, close enough that the nearness itself was a fact rather than a statement. "You know," he said, "when I first started bringing you sacks of impounded groceries, I told myself it was strictly about not letting good coffee go to waste." "I know. It was never about the coffee." "I know that too," Birdie said, and the corner of her mouth moved, and then the whole of it did. Birdie Calloway, who had stood near the back door of every room in Prairie Bend for 6 years while the county looked straight through her, and who now sat on the porch of her own house, in a marriage built on Thursday mornings and honest hands and a debt quietly paid before she'd even known it needed paying, smiled the smile of a woman who had learned in the end the one thing the whole long quiet wait had been teaching her all along. No one had to notice her for her to be worth noticing. She had simply gone on doing careful work, at the back of the room and the front of it both, until the right person happened to look up, and even then, she reminded herself, closing her eyes against the last warm light of the evening, she had never once needed his looking up to know exactly what she was worth. She had simply been glad, finally, that he had.